Tonight, 4 different people all claiming I lived through the scariest Dogman encounter ever. Only you can decide which is the scariest. All 4 stories read by P.Q. Ribber. Story number 1. Dogmanus Interruptus. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I lived through the scariest Dogman encounter ever, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. It was a chilly autumn night in the woods of northern Michigan, and I was driving down County Highway 557, which is an unlit 2-lane highway zipping through forests and fields around Cornell, Michigan. I was passing sort of by the Gwynn State Forest area on my way home from a long day of work, and I was tired. I'd been speeding along for hours, and I was eager to get home. As I drove deeper into the forest, I began to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods were dark and foreboding, and I couldn't see anything beyond the headlights of my car. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't get the notion out of my head. When I'm nervous, I feel like I have to pee. Same thing when I'm cold. This was a cold night where I was feeling nervous, so I decided I'd better find a spot somewhere on this dark road where I could hop into the woods and hydrate some of the vegetation. After what seemed an eternity of driving, I finally saw a spot where I could pull off the asphalt to relieve myself. I got out of the car and trotted quickly a short distance into the woods, hopping up and down to prevent anything happening too soon. As I was finally doing my business and feeling a most intense sense of relief, I heard a strange noise that erased all that. It was a low growling sound, and it seemed to be coming from behind me. The trouble was, that growling sound made me nervous, and the more nervous I got, the more I had to pee. The more I did my business, the more the growling behind me intensified, which in turn made me even more nervous. When I finally finished, I then had to repackage everything downstairs, and I kept praying that if I continued acting nonchalant, the growling animal would either go away or maybe fall asleep from boredom. I turned around and found that neither was the case. I looked and I saw the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It was a huge, 8-foot-tall, upright canine. Its eyes glowed golden yellow in the dark, and its teeth gleamed greenish off-white in the moonlight. It was like a werewolf from a movie, but a good movie, not something made in the last 10 years. The nasty-smelling beast man growled again, and I knew I had to get back to my car as fast as possible. I ran deeper into the woods, trying to throw the Dogman off my trail, then doubled back around to my car as fast as I could. Wherever I went, the Dogman chased me. It was incredibly fast, and it seemed to be gaining on me with each step. I reached my car just in time, and I jumped in, slamming the door shut behind me. I turned the key in the ignition, and of course, it didn't start. I saw the Dogman emerging from the woods, and I prayed before trying it a second time, promising I would go to church every Sunday for a month if it started. It started, and as I hit the gas to drive away from that lonely, smelly place, I was already starting to negotiate with God in my mind, like maybe could I break those 4 Sundays up over the course of a year or 2? But the terror wasn't over yet. The Dogman didn't give up that easily. It chased my car down the road for what seemed like well over a mile, increasing speed as I did, then keeping up with my car, even though I was driving at the speed limit. It only stopped when I finally reached a main road, and the Dogman vanished into the woods. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't made it to my car in time. All I know is that I lived through the scariest Dogman encounter ever, and I'll never forget it. Story number 2. The Dogman Church Fight. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I lived through the scariest Dogman story ever. It happened a few years back when I was driving down Route 421 through Madison, Indiana, on my way back from visiting a friend out of town. It was getting late and the road was quiet with few cars around. As I drove near the Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge, I saw something that I will never forget. 2 massive creatures, each 7 feet tall or taller, were engaged in some kind of altercation in front of a white church by the road. They both looked like a cross between a dog and a man, and each of them had long, shaggy fur covering their bodies. It was as if I stumbled upon something from another world. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes and thought it was a prank or a special effect from a movie shoot. We're talking about 2 dog-headed werewolves, basically. I don't even know if a human could have recreated that scene, or 2 humans in costumes. I don't think the anatomy was human anatomy, and I was fascinated, but also more than a little scared. I just wanted to get past them somehow and move on. I tried to drive around them, but as I did, they both turned their animosity toward me and my car. I could sense their hostility, and it felt as if they wanted to tear me apart. One of them started running toward my car, and the other followed closely behind. In that moment, I felt a rush of adrenaline that surged through my veins. My only instinct was to floor the gas pedal and escape as fast as I could. The car roared as I peeled out and began to outrun them. I could hear their howls of rage. It was like being in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, trying not to glance in the rearview mirror and prolong the terror. I had never driven so fast in my life. And after what felt like an eternity, they began to look smaller in the rearview mirror, and I knew that I had outrun them for the time being. I stopped the car at the nearest gas station and tried to calm myself down. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I thought to myself, what on earth just happened? I will never forget that night. I don't know what those creatures were, but I know for sure they were not normal animals. They were something beyond comprehension, something that should have never existed. Whenever I drive down that road at night, I can't help but feel a shiver down my spine and remember that terrifying encounter. Story number 3. Dogman Turf War in Swamp Lake. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I lived through the scariest Dogman encounter ever, even though it started out as the perfect getaway for this overworked professional. I have always been fascinated with nature, and camping in Swamp Lake State Natural Area in Wisconsin been on my bucket list for years. Finally, I decided to take the plunge and head out on a camping adventure in July of last year. I won't get into details, but I severely needed some time off just to myself and nobody else. Upon arriving, I was struck by the sheer beauty of the place. The lush greenery, the towering trees, and the serene lake all left me in awe. As I set up my tent, I couldn't help but notice the abundance of wildlife around me. From chipmunks scampering around to birds chirping in the trees, the entire area was buzzing with life. The trees were a mix of towering pines and smaller deciduous trees. There were ferns, wildflowers, and grasses of all sorts that seemed to emanate a sweet, earthy smell. The air was warm and thick, causing beads of sweat to form on my forehead. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sights, sounds, and smells shifted. The sky turned to shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sound of crickets chirping lingered in the air, punctuated by the occasional croak of a frog and the rustling of trees in the breeze. As the night wore on, the forest seemed to come alive. I heard the rustling of leaves and twigs, undoubtedly the sound of small animals foraging for food. Occasionally I'd hear the hoot of an owl or the howl of a distant coyote. These sounds were eerie, yet at the same time comforting, as they let me know I wasn't entirely alone. At one point I sat at the edge of the lake, staring out at the mirror-like surface. The only sounds were the water lapping at the shore and the occasional call of the loons. As much as I enjoyed the solitude and silence, I couldn't help but feel a little on edge, as if I was intruding on a world that wasn't meant for me. That night, I awoke in my tent at a loud sound, but in my sleepy state, I wasn't sure what I had heard. It sure sounded to me like a pack of dogs were fighting in my camp, just outside my tent. But what was the likelihood of something like that happening? When the sounds of fighting just kept going on, I decided I'd better unzip the tent, just enough so I could look out there. My heart was racing as I peeked out into the darkness, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't your grandpa's dogs fighting out there. They were half-human, half-canine creatures, and they were tearing at each other like they were fighting for survival. I couldn't quite make out the faces in the dark, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. I'd heard stories of werewolves or dogmen, but I never imagined I would see them in real life. Pulling my head back into the tent, I took a shot of whiskey I brung with me in case I see impossible things outside my tent. But even after I took a good belt, I could still hear those inconvenient dogmen outside continuing to be real and in the same world that I was in. My mind raced with questions. Were they honestly out there? Were they dangerous? Should I call for help? I knew I shouldn't have come alone, but it was too late for regrets now. I unzipped the tent a bit to get a view of the battle. As the fighting continued, I noticed that one of them pushed the rest off and ran away into the dense woods. The others howled in frustration and anger as they watched it go. One of them, the biggest of the pack, let out a blood-curdling snarl before turning back to face the others. The 3 remaining wolfmen circled each other, growling and baring their teeth, sizing each other up, waiting for an opportunity to attack again. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to make a decision quickly. I quickly zipped up my tent, hoping they didn't hear me. I knew that I had to leave Swamp Lake State Natural Area as soon as possible. I began packing my things quietly and as quickly as I could. I didn't want to risk making any noise that would draw their attention. Suddenly I heard rustling outside my tent. My heart stopped as I imagined one of the wolfmen sniffing around for me. Peeking out, just enough to see, I saw one of the wolfmen circling my tent as if it knew I was there. I froze, not knowing what to do. It was then that the wolfmen stopped circling and simply walked away into the woods. They seemed to have reacted to my presence by simply moving their business elsewhere. That was not what I was expecting, to be certain. I mean, they just acted like this was no longer a good place to have a turf war, like I'd ruined everything by camping on their personal battlefield. I waited a few more minutes, and they seemed to have actually left. Quickly, I grabbed my belongings and headed out of the park, looking back over my shoulder the entire way out of there. I know this is the scariest Dogman encounter of all time, and I made it through alive with nobody's help but my own.
Hey, it's your old pal Bigfoot with a hot new offer for you for summer. Snag these badass new Scary Stories NYC sandal slide things modeled here by your old pal Bigfoot and take 25% of the price off by using the checkout code YTShopping25. It's a sweet deal for both of us because YouTube is covering that 25% discount. The link should be in the description, and if you're on YouTube and it's May or June of 2023, then you might see an image of it right under this video. It comes in 5 different colors, so use them to express yourselves. And now here's another Dogman story.
Story number 4. West Virginia Werewolf Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm going to tell you about the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and in fact, I'm sure it's the scariest Dogman experience of all time. I was driving north on Route 11 in the middle of a dark night, having just left Virginia, and now finding myself following my grandmother's directions, driving on a one-lane unlit road, going through the woods of West Virginia. They don't call it Route 11 locally, though. There, it's called Big Oak Tree Road. That's because it's named after a big guy named Oakland Tree who built the first one-lane road to hell in the USA. Do you believe me? You shouldn't. No, obviously, it's called Big Oak Tree Road because it's lined with oak trees on both sides. I was just testing to see if you were still awake, because you're going to need to be paying attention to follow this one. This is something that happened to me back in the early 90s, and it's the scariest Dogman Encounter story you're ever going to hear. So this road was barely wide enough for me to fit on, and I was nervous about traffic coming up at me from ahead or traffic coming up faster than me from behind. I kept checking for space on the sides where I could pull off, especially if the road got even a little bendy. I was paranoid about getting into an accident, and then, all of a sudden, without any warning at all, as I was about to go up a slight incline, the car just clicked off and sputtered out. It made a sound like my grandmother, the cigar smoker, used to make when she first got up in the morning. This sort of wet, wheezing, coughing noise. And then that car engine went as still and quiet as a mob victim buried in a New Jersey swamp. I was more than a little surprised, and I didn't even know the car was sick, let alone ready to pass out. When I couldn't restart the engine, I got out to look under the hood. Of course, that was when a car came rolling along, only to find me blocking the road in front of him. At first he beeped. Then he got out and came over to see what the problem was. He spoke in a nervous manner, twitching like a meth head and twisting his legs as though he had to go to the bathroom or something. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him that my car stopped running in the middle of the road. That was not the answer he wanted to hear, and he informed me of this several times over, each time with the greater emphasis on the word not. He seemed to be trying to intimidate me, so I looked him directly in the eye, and I very quietly told him that I didn't care what he wanted to hear. I only cared about the truth. Now the guy flipped out into a rant about how he already knew everything I said before I said it. Then he stomped on the ground a few times and he asked me if I even knew what information was. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my car, and this guy was asking me to define the concept of information. When I didn't answer, he answered for me. If a sentence contains no new information, he insisted, then it has no novelty. And that was me, he said. I had no novelty because I spoke but I said nothing, just like all the politicians he voted against. Then he started ranting about politics. I still had no idea what was wrong with my car, but I noted that it had stopped smoking. That might be a good thing, indicating that it might have cooled down, or it might mean that the heap is deader than ever. The guy was still ranting about equations proving something about information or disproving it, when I interrupted to ask him if he knew what was wrong with my car. That actually shut him up for a second, and he stared at me, wide-eyed, through completely dilated pupils. I asked the freak again if he knew anything about cars, reasoning that if he could get my car running, I could get out of his way. Well, at first I thought I had offended him, and that he was throwing some kind of tantrum, but then I realized it was more like the poor guy was having a fit, like a mental spaz out or something. I don't know what to call it. I'm not a hospital worker, but this guy was shaking all over. He was still screaming, only now, instead of screaming about semantics, he was screaming out in pain. And then the weirdo started cracking and bending in wrong directions. He looked like a human special effect, but I wasn't sure what movie I was watching a scene from. It felt like my eyes were being tickled from the inside when I would try to look directly at the guy, and I wasn't really sure what I was seeing happen in front of me. Then he started laughing, right? But this crazy kind of laughter, not anything healthy or normal. And this time when I looked at him, I seen that his ears have gone all pointed. He's a lot hairier than before. I asked him, "Mister, are you okay?" But obviously he wasn't, and I was so scared I felt nauseous. I went and sat in the car so I could watch him, but not get any of his bodily fluids on me, as he seemed to be having the strangest epileptic fit in history. And then, I swear, the next time I saw that nutcase, he had a long dog snout, and he was covered in silver fur all over. He looked like a human version of a wolf, but with much shaggier fur than a wolf is supposed to have. He howled like a werewolf in a movie and charged off into the woods, leaving me alone, sitting there in my dead car. I sat there, listening to the crickets for a while. Then I turned and looked back at the Freakazoid's car. Its door was open, and the lights were on inside. It didn't seem like it would hurt anything if I just checked to see if Captain Canine left the keys in the ignition or not. Well, what do you know? The guy who couldn't think straight left the keys right where I needed them. I got into his crate, started it up, put her in reverse, and backed up to the closest area where I could make a U-turn. Then I drove down to someplace in Virginia. I think it was maybe Hancock or Berkeley Springs. I forget. But I found a phone and got a garage to tow my car in. Then I drove the Nutter's car over to the garage, and the rest is boring. But nothing leading up to that ending was, and that's because you just listened to the scariest Dogman story of all time.
Anna White is who we want to thank for sending us something to put in the bank. Please join me in thanking Anna White, who sent us a generous super thanks last night and thereby made this episode possible today. You too can send us a super thanks by clicking that thanks button under this or any of our YouTube videos. And in so doing, you buy us a meal, or maybe you buy my cat some cat food, or maybe I can buy a potato at Trader Joe's. Whatever it is, it's more than we've got right now, and we appreciate everyone who can help. So thanks, Anna White. Here to explain how you too can be as cool as Anna White is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.